Welcome back. Now we're going to jump into the supply side. So the supply side is going to be purchasers, consumers, to some extent, and supply gets a little confusing to some students because supply side it's depending on the business, but even most sellers are to some level, they're buyers also. So you've got sellers that are bringing goods to market. Those sellers that have brought these goods to market are actually at some point in the production process, they are buyers, purchasers, consumers. So the supply side, maybe not hardly as cut and dried as, at least to me, as the demand side, because a seller and the supply, so demand and buyers are kind of tied together. Sellers and and supply are kind of tied together too. But at the same time, a seller at some point is actually functioning as a purchaser, a consumer, a buyer, because they have to have factors of production, again, to make the goods and services that they actually sell. So we'll try to hope I don't get everybody too confused as we go through it. But we'll start out just quickly. Why do sellers bring goods to market? If you remember, and I think it was in chapter 1, what are the three things that differentiate economics from other social sciences? Opportunity cost, making decisions at the margin, and what was the third one? Self-interest. Individuals optimizing, companies optimizing some functional relationship. And that is, and that is what we see it on the seller side is, again, they are optimizing, for the most part, they're optimizing profits. And just check this. Okay. So they are optimizing profits. And so it goes back to self-interest. And profits is, if you've had any finance classes, or you may not have, and this is, some of your, I guess, initial foray, maybe as undergraduate students, into kind of the econ finance side of the house, you're talking about profit is just simply the basic formula of profit is revenue minus expenses. And so sellers on the supply side are looking at selling price, and then they're also looking at the cost of production. And that cost of production is not only the factors of production, and again, go back to the factors of production, we're talking about labor, capital stock, natural resources, technology, entrepreneurship, but we're also thinking about things like marketing cost, advertising, transportation, and those, all of them go together into the production cost. So that's what drives cost of production. Cost of production is going to drive the profit that either an individual makes as an entrepreneur or a company's making. So profit drives it. And if we think about quantity supplied, it's the quantity sellers are willing to sell of a good or service at a particular price during a particular time, ceteris paribus. So quantity supplied, and again, when we're looking at quantity supplied, and we're going to get into it, it's going to be driven by the law of supply. So we had a law of demand that we talked about. Now we're going to talk about law of supply. For most goods or services, a higher price leads to an increase in the quantity supplied, and a lower price leads to a decrease in the quantity supplied. So demand curve, downward sloping. And what do we say about the law of demand? Lower price, greater the quantity demanded. Higher price, lower quantity demanded. If you flip that over, your supply curve is going to be upward sloping, and it's being driven by a higher price is going to lead with more quantity supplied, and a lower price, as you slide down that supply schedule or that supply curve, it's going to bring lower quantity supplied. And just like demand, it starts out with the supply schedule, prices and quantities supplied. And you make a table in Excel, you grab it, you graph it, and you're off and running with your supply schedule. And similar to demand, the supply curve is a graphical representation of a supply schedule. And again, it's upward sloping. And what I guess is a little different is that it's upward sloping because you've got increasing marginal cost of production. And as it's increasing marginal cost of production, you're going to have a higher price to make a profit. That's kind of the basics of it. And so similar to demand, the supply curve, for the most part, there are rare exceptions, but for the most part, it's upward sloping. You can get some vertical, you can get some horizontal, but for the most part, that supply curve is going to be upward sloping, and again, at about a 45-degree angle, just like the demand curve's downward sloping at about a 45-degree angle. So you're going to have it at, there are some things that, and if you think about, a vertical supply curve or of a supply curve that's nearly vertical, you think about what would be a good or service that might have a near vertical supply curve, and the first thing comes to mind is land. Land is fixed. There's only so much land in the United States. I think the book used New York City, that there's certain lots in New York City or parcels of land in New York City that it doesn't matter what the price is, there's only one of them. So but again, for the most part, with the exception of some very rare occurrences, your supply schedule is going to be upward sloping. And when we talk about the change in the quantity supplied, we're talking about movement along the supply curve driven by a change of price. So they're moving along that up and down that supply curve. The supply curve itself isn't changing because you've got parameters just like demand. Remember, when we're drawing these initial demand and supply curves, we're invoking ceteris paribus, all other things equal and nothing's unchanged. So you really have to think about nothing's changing on the factors of production, or nothing's changing in production cost or perception, and we'll get into some of those here in just a minute, but those are all fixed. So you're moving along that supply curve, and so that's the change in quantity supplied. Now, if you're shifting the supply curve, you're shifting it, you can either say right or left, you can say up or down. I prefer to keep it similar to the demand curve, talking about shifting right or left. So if I'm shifting it right, the supply curve is coming in this direction, and that means an increase in supply. If I'm shifting the supply curve to the left, it's a decrease in supply, and it's going to shift to the left. So, and we talk about changes in supply because you're shifting the supply curve. And a change in supply curve, or the shift in the supply curve, is going to be driven by supply shifters. And a variable that can change the quantity of a good or service supplied at each price. You're not talking about moving up and down the supply curve and looking at quantities that, with the supply curve constant and looking at quantities at different prices, you're talking about changes in units because at every price, because that supply curve is either shifting down to the right or it's shifting up to the left. So you're talking about as demand, we talked about increasing the demand units at every price to the right and to the left. Now we're talking about supply. Supply is going down to the right, or supply curve is shifting up to the left. And just to get into the supply shifters, similar to we had demand shifters, the number one that comes up is cost of inputs and the resources producers use to make goods or services. And again, what are those inputs? Factors of production. Factors of production, again, we're talking about labor, we're talking about capital stock, we're talking about natural resources. You're talking about the change in technology. You're talking about entrepreneurship, even though when we're talking about the cost of inputs, economists will kind of take and parse those aside. And also on top of labor and capital stock and natural resources, you've got other things thrown in. You're talking about packaging and transportation and marketing and energy and advertisement, and there's some other costs of production that we haven't been including in the factors of production. And if you think about it, as the cost of production, as the cost of inputs go up, what happens to profit? For the most part, profit's going to go down, and sellers are going to say, what? I'm not going to offer as much, I'm not going to supply as many units for sale. And so you're talking about, as the cost of inputs go up, you're going to shift that supply curve to the left, and there's going to be fewer at every price, fewer units offered for sale. As for some reason the cost of inputs go down, you're talking about increasing profits, and you're going to shift that supply curve over to the right. And so now sellers are saying, hey, I like the profit margin I'm looking at. I'm going to offer more units for supply. So that's the input of your cost of your inputs on the supply curve. Now we're going to talk about technology. And so technology, it's again, we've gone over it before, but it's the knowledge that can be applied to the production of goods and services. We're turning inputs. We talked about cost of inputs. We bought those inputs. We're turning inputs through the production process into outputs. And if you can either increase the efficiency of your technology, so you're increasing the efficiency, you're talking about using fewer inputs, or you can get more output with the same number of inputs, you're going to say, my technology, I've gotten more efficient. My profit margin should be on the upswing. So as technology goes up, what happens to the shift in the supply curve? It's going to shift to the right. It's going to go up too. So sellers are going to say, man, I'm getting more efficient at production. My production process is really humming along. I'm going to offer more units for sale. If for some reason technology starts to drop and I'm not as efficient, then I'm going to say, I'm not going to offer as many units for sale, and depends on how many sellers take that approach, you're going to see that supply curve start to shift up to the left. And you think about what could, and especially I've had students look at me and say, well, if you're at a certain level of technology, why would all of a sudden technology go down? Looks like technology through AI and automation and a lot of different factors, looks like, technology would continue to go up. And in theory, technology would continue to go up, but because of laws and regulations can inhibit technology, it doesn't always move in that way. So again, you've got things, the laws, regulations, and if I think about it, there are certain European countries that I don't think it's started here in the United States yet, but will not allow GMO, genetically modified, species, hybrid varieties of corn, soybeans. They won't let GMO products in the agricultural realm be produced. Some countries are trying to drive their agricultural community toward organic farming. You've got wine production in France. It can only be produced in certain areas, and to be, labeled a Bordeaux, it's got to be in the Bordeaux region, or a Rhone, it's got to be in the Rhone Alps, and, Champagne can only be in, the Champagne region. So laws and regulations can stifle technology. And, it could be like, throwing a bucket of cold water on, AI and robotics, because you're not going to be able to increase your technology to the point that you would like to have it, because some countries, and again, think about when we talked about, and I guess it was in the tail end of chapter 2, maybe, when we were talking about the market capitalist economy, and one of the things that drove countries like Germany and France, they weren't market capitalists. They were close, but not really. And they were in that mixed market economy because of laws and regulations. And if I think about, my, I guess, tenure in healthcare, what I found over the years is the more that you can use technology in a process, the more that you can automate, and the more that you can move from manual labor or processes that take a lot of manual labor and a lot of hands-on. If you can move away from that, not only is it more efficient, but it takes human error out of these situations. So again, as technology goes up, supply curve is going to shift out to the right. Technology comes down, supply curve is going to start to shift back to the left. And we're talking about, and so we've moved from technology, and now we're going to talk for a few minutes about alternative activities. And, you're talking about returns from alternative activities. And it goes back again to what we talked about that sets economics, what differentiates economics from your social sciences. We talked about the marginal, making decisions at the margin. We talk about self-interest, talk about opportunity cost. Opportunity cost, again, it's another one. And so opportunity cost, so the change, you've got a couple of alternatives. So the change in price of one decreases the supply of the other good. And what most, or at least I grew up on a farm, and that mainly gone to agricultural, generated or agricultural focused universities, Ohio State, Western Kentucky universities, kind of the agricultural focus. And you think about wheat and corn. So I'm a farmer, and I'm sitting in my home looking at my available acres of cropland, and I have to make a decision because it's getting close to planting time. I have to make a decision. Do I plant corn? Do I plant wheat? Do I plant soybeans? And so you start looking at what the returns of alternative goods and services are. It's the same thing with, if you're raising cattle and hogs, you're looking at what the future prices and what your potential returns are going to be. And at least in the agricultural community, you can look at futures and options, and you can look at what the futures price, or estimating that the value of a bushel of corn is going to be in, say, September, October, and there's a future and options price setting out there. So you have some idea of what the market thinks that the price is going to be. But again, you're having to make that decision in like, December, January, February, what you're going to plant to drive your returns and your revenues in the fall. So you're really concerned about global forecast and international trade. And then that kind of leads us into seller expectations. And you're talking about decisions about production or sales are made long before the product is ready for sale. I mean, again, think about the guy trying to figure out, does he plant corn, soybean, or wheat? Having to make that decision in the winter on what his returns are going to be in the fall. And that's actually a short kind of timeline. Think about individuals producing wine. Think about individuals distilling bourbon or scotch or Irish whiskey. You're talking about commodities that have a long shelf life. You're thinking about the shelf life, and you've got to remember the kind of, so now you're talking about the what are we going to produce, how are we going to produce it, for whom are we going to produce it, and how are we going to keep some reserves in there. So seller expectation is vital on how that supply curve is going to shift, or at least how the future is going to shift and how the potential future is going to shift depending on the decisions that are made by that individual at a point in time. And if I just think about bourbon, so to be considered bourbon, you have to be, I don't know, 51% corn. So it's going to impact, the price of corn. And it's got to be aged for at least 2 years in new charred oak barrels. So if you want to produce bourbon and be labeled bourbon, you're talking about, you secure your inputs of production, you distill it down, you purchase the barrels, and once you put it in the barrel, it's got to sit there for 2 years at least. And some of your high-cost bourbons have sat in that barrel for like 15, 20 years. Same thing with Scotch and same thing with Irish whiskey. So you just know that if you're making your decisions now, just look at how vital seller expectations are. We've already talked about price, but the seller expectations are paramount in deciding what's going to happen to that supply curve in the future. Is it going to come down to the right? Is it going to go up or to the left? And then one of the last things you kind of think about is and people kind of blow this off, I think, but think about the natural events, storms and infestations and droughts. If you think about, natural events, what if hail comes through in the middle of the growing season in, Indiana or, Ohio or Illinois and just, wipes out the corn crop? Or if there's a corn blight hits and wipes out the corn crop, what do you think that's going to do to the supply curve? If you've got an increase in natural events and it wipes out that supply curve, it's going to shift. It's going to shift. It's going to decrease, and it's going to shift to the left. Likewise, if you have a great growing season and you've got a lot of rain, a lot of sunshine, and everything just works perfectly, that's going to increase supply, and it's going to shift that supply curve to the right. You've got, that's especially in kind of the corn, soybean, wheat growing areas. You've always got hail. You've always got possibility of tornadoes, insects and disease. A few years ago, fires in Northern California, they were afraid it was going to wipe out, the wine growing area of Napa and Sonoma. You think about, hurricanes, or you think about premature frost or a cold winter in Florida or the Rio Grande Valley or or you're talking about, maybe Arizona or California. What's that going to do to the citrus crop? Or you have issues in Southern California. What does that do? Does it wipe out the avocado industry? So you've got all of these natural events. And the more natural events and the more significant those natural events, it's going to shift. The more significant, it's going to shift that supply curve up to the left. If you don't have them, it's going to shift that supply curve down to the right, especially if you have a good growing season. So don't ever, I guess, discount the impact of natural events, especially natural weather events. And then lastly, you've got the number of sellers. Supply curve, as the supply curve includes all sellers in the market. A change in the number will change the number of sellers and, what the sellers are willing to offer at each price. So increase the number of sellers. What's going to happen to the supply curve? It's going to increase. It's going to shift downward to the right. For some reason, one of the other shifters decides that, it's going to impact the market and it scares some sellers off. So you decrease the number of sellers, it's going to shift that supply curve to the left. So, and that's one thing I want everybody to understand is a lot of times these supply shifters are not impacting in isolation. They can be moving, together at the same time. They can be impacting the market at different times, can be moving in conjunction with each other. They can act in isolation, but a lot of times they are working together, and it makes it somewhat difficult to figure out, maybe not so much figure out which way that supply curve is going to shift, but figure out what the magnitude of that supply curve is going to shift is going to be. And I think I'm going to kind of stop right there, and we will come back and we'll talk about when you start to pull all this together, when you start pulling the downward sloping demand curve, the upward sloping supply curve together, and we're going to talk about equilibrium prices and equilibrium quantities. So that's going to kind of wrap us up here, and I'll be back in a few minutes. Thank you.